No right to be right. No right to be wrong. In the Irish political parlance, right now means not preserving decent values of civilization, of Irishness, of the family. It means something pernicious, evil, wicked, heartless, misogynistic, xenophobic. All the vices that any society can ever accumulate are now described by the abuse of that word, right. And if you are perceived to be of the right, and I do not perceive myself to be of the right, but that is a term that is used about me. If you are perceived to be of the right, you have no right to be wrong. You can't make an error. All your observations have to be spot on, down the centre line of political correctness. And if you deviate in any real sense from that central line, if you don't conform, if you don't comply, reputational ruin can follow, which is what happened to me. Now, I feel no bitterness or anger about what happened to me. That is a fact of life. Others will follow. Others have gone before me. This is the world in which we live. I call this the imminent regime that we are facing into a Fourth Reich. The term comes from a German historian in 1915. It was used by Hitler later on. The First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire from 800 to 1806. The Second Reich was that of Kaiser Bill. But there was an intermediate Reich, that of Napoleon. It's not called the Second Reich, but it deserves to be, because it has the same characteristics of the three Reichs we're talking about, and the Third Reich was, of course, Hitler's Reich. All these Reichs not merely infuse their rulers with almost preternatural powers, it invoked a sense of almost theological majesty in the exercise of the rule of law and the rule of government. This was not just ordinary government of people. This was a ruler that was almost divine. And each of the rulers, Kaiser Bill, the Holy Roman Empire, and Hitler, intended to have a 1,000-year Reich. And I believe we are in the early stages of another Reich. Now, it won't be like the Third Reich, but it will be despotic, totalitarian, and complete in its vision. The way it imposes its will on its subjects. And these people, us, we will not be citizens of this Reich. We will be subjects. And the extraordinary thing, and the most sinister thing about this Reich, is that it has no leader. Every day the political correctness values are created somewhere on the internet, somewhere in the ether. And new laws emerge at dawn, which can by dusk destroy a life, destroy reputations, destroy futures. I date the onset of this Reich from 1989, when I had the good fortune to be in Prague to watch communism collapse. And what brought about the collapse of the Third Reich, of the Communist Reich, was the failure of the functionaries of that regime to believe in the fictions of communism anymore. They could no more subject themselves to the rule of that law any more than they could impose it on others. This is the year that Francis Fukuyama wrote the book The End of History, and it appeared at that time that the world had embarked on a new regime of social democracy and the welfare state. In fact, we were moving in another direction, and I didn't know it. 1989 was the year that political correctness first arrived on these shores. It was the year that two forms of censoriousness emerged. In Ireland, a group of 6 lecturers in the history department at Trinity College assisted in the blockade of a lecture room to prevent the English historian David Irving from offering his very controversial views upon the Third Reich. Now, you can detest David Irving. Most people do. Fairly justly so. But we are still entitled to hear him. And 6 members of the Trinity History Department said it was their duty as historians to protect democracy from hate speech. It is not their duty to do any such thing. Democracy must look after itself. Those Trinity 6 were never punished, never suspended. And silencing of unwanted speech, controversial speech, is now a norm in universities across Ireland and across Europe. 1989 was also the bicentenary of the French Revolution, so it was appropriate that it should also be a turning point in the history of Europe. As a matter of interest, 1989 was also the year of the invention of what was called then the Intel 586 silicon chip. It was the first silicon chip to have the capacity of 1 million transistors. It's now known as the Pentel, and every single mobile phone in this room has a Pentel chip. Every laptop, every iPhone, every tablet. This is the engine that has powered the internet revolution and has changed the way people live and the way they think. I mentioned the French Revolution because this was the revolution that imposed upon us the 3 contradictory values of liberté, fraternité, égalité. If you are free, you are not obliged to be anyone's brother, and you're certainly not obliged to be equal to anyone. That is the meaning of freedom. You are not my brother, I am somebody else, I am better than you, I'm worse than you, but I'm not equal to you. One quality has survived from that trinity to be incorporated into the trinity of meaningless political values that has been imposed on us since then. And that quality is equality. Now, I don't know what equality means. How can I support something I don't understand? Do you want your plumber to have the same plumbing skills as your doctor, and vice versa? There is no real transcendent meaning to this word, equality. And I am uncomfortable by expressing my doubts about equality because men I greatly revere, like Steven Pinker and Simon Baron-Cohen and Jordan Peterson, who has recently been banned in Cambridge, they use the word equality a great deal. So maybe they see something in equality that I don't understand. And I'm entitled to say to you, I don't understand it without me being evil. But as I say, equality has survived. Brotherhood and freedom have been jettisoned. And now we have the new trinity of virtues: diversity, equality, and inclusion. Diversity, equality, and inclusion. It's the new motto for UCD. This is how University College Dublin, the home of James Joyce, who was equal to nobody, is describing itself. Diversity, equality, and inclusion. This is the university that has a first-class honours degree and a second-class honours degree and a third-class honours degree and a pass degree. All equal, apparently. This is a university that has no working-class students. It has very few students from abroad. It demands that students have 1,000 points in their leaving cert. It rigorously excludes the poor the lazy, the inept, the illiterate, and it calls itself inclusive. What we're learning here is words have no meaning in this new regime. You just throw these pieties out. It's like having a catering college with the letters or the words salmonella, botulism, and gastroenteritis over its opening portals. Equality actually is a scales with no fulcrum. It's a horizontal tape measure without vertical delineations. It's meaningless. And we use this word as if it conferred a piety, a sanctimoniousness, a goodness, and a value upon things that are not equal. Gay marriage cannot be equal to heterosexual marriage because heterosexual marriage demands the act of consummation. The act of consummation is specifically sexual intercourse involving the penis and the vagina. No such act can occur in a homosexual union, and I welcome homosexual unions. But I cannot say that the union between two homosexuals is equal to the union between two homosexual people. Yet I'm obliged to. This is now the Constitution of Ireland, that these two forms of union are equal. The Sexual Offences Act of 2006 instituted another form of egalitarianism into Irish law. If two 16-year-olds have sex, fully consensual sex, by that law, the female cannot go to jail and the male can. That is actually written in the law. Two 16-year-olds have sex. The law, in all its egalitarian splendour, ruled that the boy should go to jail and the girl should not. And this equality has different sets of values. Women, blacks, Africans, homosexuals, not so much working class people, but these are more equal than the lower form of animal life, also known as Kevin Myers. And there isn't anything lower than a heterosexual aging male within the dispensation within which we all live. And if you want to seek new levels in this hierarchy, a recent one was invented, called veganism. Veganism 2 years ago didn't have an identity. It was a fad. It might have been a healthy fad or a bad fad, but it was a fad. Now it's a quantifiable, measurable identity. And as Kevin was saying, rules are changing so quickly. Society is changing so quickly. Values are changing so quickly that you can never predict what's going to happen next. But what you can predict is that institutions no longer behave for the purpose that they originally invented to do. News is no longer news unless it suits some agenda within the newsroom. We, all of us, across Ireland, across Europe, were appalled, disgusted by the events in Christchurch. Consummation of evil. Good people attending the service to worship their God were slaughtered. The Guardian / Observer gave 6 pages to that slaughter. The Irish Times gave it not quite as much, but nearly as much coverage. 2 months before that, a Catholic cathedral in the Philippines was bombed. 20 people were slaughtered immediately. Scores were injured. Of those injured, many must have died, but I don't know how many died because the story vanished. The Guardian carried a 1/4 page coverage of that slaughter. by ISIS, I should say, by Islamic fundamentalists, and the Irish Times didn't mention it at all. They were Roman Catholics. And in our new hierarchy, in our new dispensation, and within our new rules, Catholics don't count as much as they used to. And one of the peculiar things about the era in which we live is that organisations no longer function in the way that they're meant to, that they were set up to do. I have already told you about the Irish Times failure to cover the bombing in the Philippines, which killed and injured perhaps 100 people. Not mention it. Or not as far as I can see. But there's a kind of left liberal folklore which has emerged within the EU over the last few decades, which anathematizes, marginalizes, execrates enemies, opposition, people they disagree with. And in this world, disagreement is a statement of enmity. It's not just something you try to negotiate your way around, where you listen to somebody and they listen to you, and maybe in little sparks, not of hatred, not of fire, but of illumination, we get to understand one another. That's what education is about. It's what civilization is about. It's what journalism used to be about. The Irish Times recently wrote that the Swedish Democrats that had done well in the election last year in Sweden were Nazi in origin. Well, the Swedish Democrats, first of all, opposed to continuing member of the EU and are in favour of controlled immigration. In both regards, I would take that line. I think the EU is a failed entity. You might disagree with me. And I'm absolutely in favour of controlled immigration. I welcome immigration, but it must be controlled into any society. Otherwise, within a generation, it ceases to be a society. It becomes a fragmentary hodgepodge of different identities. But the Irish Times said that the Swedish Democrats had Nazi origins. One member, founding member of the Swedish Democrats in 1968, had served in the Waffen-SS during the war. I don't know that he was a war criminal. He might very well have been. But merely because he was an SS man didn't make the origin of the Swedish Democrats Nazi, any more than the fact that Arthur Griffith was an anti-Semite. That didn't make Sinn Féin movement an anti-Semitic movement. And merely because you're listening to me here this evening doesn't mean that you represent, I represent your opinions, or that somehow or other we are united in beliefs. You are listening to me. I'm looking at you, and soon I'll be listening to you. But we are different entities. A rather more grievous episode of language confusion touches upon a woman called Elizabeth Sabadich-Wolff. 10 years ago, she was giving a talk on her perception of immigration and Islam, and she raised the question of, privately, not in the main hall, of whether or not Muhammad could be considered a child abuser because he married his last wife at the age of 8. An Austrian magazine called News, in the English, had an undercover reporter there who recorded this, and she was prosecuted. And she defended her observation and the fact that the facts about Muhammad are known from the Hadith, which is the traditional sayings that describe Muhammad's life. She was convicted and she appealed at various Austrian courts and finally went to the European Court of Human Rights, which defends freedom of speech. And the European Court of Human Rights, guarding our freedoms in Ireland, as well as guarding the freedoms across Europe, from the Atlantic to the Baltic. Recently, they came up with the finding 10 years after the first conviction. Her statements are likely to arouse justified indignation in Muslims and her abusive attack conflicted with the rights of others to have their religious feelings protected and to have religious peace preserved in Austrian society. So merely the feelings of those people who don't like her opinions trump our freedom of speech. And the court ruled that the anger felt by Muslims would be justified. But 3 years ago, Fiona Shaw, the Irish actress, played the Virgin Mary in New York. It's almost a complete soliloquy. She was completely naked. She represented the Virgin Mary as naked. Now, we're all naked, but would the mother of the prophet be represented naked on a stage in Europe or the United States of America and there not be uproar? Just as we in Ireland abolished the laws on blasphemy, the European Court of Human Rights is reintroducing blasphemy, but only one kind of blasphemy. Blasphemy concerning Islam. And everyone is too scared to say, sorry, Europe is the cradle, not the birthplace, but the cradle of world Christianity. This is what shaped us, whether we're Catholics or Protestants, whether we're Jews, and I share with Kevin the feeling that we are all Jews. That's the foundation base of our identity. We're Jews at one remove. But we all know what shaped Ireland, what shaped Britain, what shaped Europe. It was belief in Christianity. It was belief in the martyrdom at Calvary. It was belief in the child being born in Bethlehem. Now, it doesn't matter whether you like these myths or not. They are what shaped us. And we've jettisoned them, and we're too scared to say, actually, these are important values. And if you have secularism without some religious component to control that secularism, you get, sooner or later, the Third Reich, or you get communism. And incredibly, most American students do not know that communism killed more people than the Nazis. Communism in the Russian Stalinist form killed more than the Nazis. Mao Zedong killed 100 million people. That's what you get when you get totalitarianism without the administration of the divine virtues of religion. Now, I'm going to be talking on these subjects later, but I accept to you now that I'm a hypocrite because I myself cannot bring myself to believe in God. I was raised as a Catholic. But I would rather live in Catholic Ireland than secular Ireland, because I know what secularism can do within no time at all. It can embrace child murder, as it has done in New York. You probably don't know because our media has not reported it. Not one newspaper has, not one news bulletin has reported the fact that within New York State, termination of pregnancy can occur up to 9 months. A baby can be aborted as it's being born, perfectly lawfully. So in that sense, our first steps to the Holocaust has begun, because the first killings of the Holocaust in the Third Reich began not with the Jews, but with mentally damaged children who were handicapped. And it doesn't take long. Quite clearly it doesn't take long to move from the disposal of the unwanted, the handicapped, the physically impaired, the mentally impaired, to grown-up human beings, and then to their children. One of the extraordinary things of the last 20 years that has defied the worst prognostications about the consequences of immigration has been the silence of the media and the police and the political classes in Britain on the rape of working class girls. I said earlier on that working class people do not figure as important characters in the dispensation organised by the politically correct. They call themselves left-wing, but these are left-wing values. They're not protection and regard for working class people. We don't know how many working class girls in Cinque estates in the north of England and in Oxfordshire have been raped. It's not less than 10,000. It might be 50,000. The town of Telford in Shropshire, we now know, reasonably certainly, that 1,000 girls were drugged, made drunk, and were raped, often repeatedly by gangs. The term unspeakable is usually a metaphor. On this occasion, it's not a metaphor. It is unspeakable, so I shall cease to speak about it. Last year, an ISIS fighter was caught in Syria. His name was Amr Hussein. He was interviewed by Reuters. He claimed to have raped 200 women and murdered 500 people, mostly by beheading. Had a US Marine, or a British soldier, or an Israeli soldier claimed to have raped 200 women and murdered 500 people, whether he had done those things or not, the allegations would have been headlines around the world. Not one newspaper in Ireland reported it. Not one broadsheet in the United Kingdom reported it. Just before Christmas. I don't watch news anymore. I don't read newspapers. But I just turned on the news by chance, intending to get something else, on RT News. 9 o'clock, they reported, the lead item, 200 cars had been burnt out in the Swedish city of Gothenburg by what the RT News would have called anti-social elements. Anti-social elements set fire to cars. Well, they were hardly social elements, were they? What was this a clue to? It was RTE saying we are not going to point the finger of truth at the real culprits, which were immigrants. So when you have riots by immigrants, they are transformed into strange, anonymous non-entities called antisocial elements. And that became lodged in the kind of norm of modern journalism. If you can't tell the truth and make your journalists remain comfortable, then you just confuse it so that everyone feels happy. No one's any wiser or better. They don't know anything more than they did when the news bulletin began. But they at least have the reassurance they're not in any way being bigoted. And not being bigoted or, evil word, right-wing, is the main goal of life within the dispensation known as political correctness. And one of the major engines in this thing comes back to Penta, that magical chip. That enables the social media to work. A few years ago, a young woman called Justine Sacco was at Heathrow Airport on her way to flights to South Africa. She's an American, she's from New York. And she has 17 friends. Inverted commas are definitely merited there. To whom she would tweet observations. She said, I am just about to catch the plane to South Africa. Hope I don't get AIDS. Oh no, I won't. I'm white. Okay, stupid thing to have said. One of her friends leaked the tweet denouncing her as a racist and a bigot and a homophobe and all the other words that get associated with the right, again in inverted commas. And by the time she was halfway to South Africa, she was the most famous person in the Twittersphere in the world. When she landed, hundreds of journalists were waiting to greet her. One of the first tweets she opened was the one sacking her. She was fired, as I was fired, but I'm an old man. She was 26 years of age. Her life was ruined. Irreversibly ruined. Because of a few remarks, stupid remarks, but she's entitled to be stupid. She's young. Everything within her life fell apart. And she's never been able to reassemble it. Now, instead of the man who leaked it, a man called Sam Biddle, being the villain of this story, he's, in his own eyes, a hero. He told a man who wrote a book about this called Jonathan Ronson, the fact that she was a PR chief. She wasn't a PR chief. She was a minor functionary in a public relations company. Made it delicious. I'd do it again. It's a young woman's life ruined, and he'd do it again. And that's the mentality we now have in this Reich. Pitilessness is actually something to be applauded. It's something to be proud of. And even the virtuous, if they get it wrong in this Reich, get no mercy. Jonathan Friedland was a corporate officer, communications officer with Netflix. And he sent out a memo to his staff discussing what terms are objectionable, offensive, unacceptable in the domain of the media. And one of the words he cited was nigger. He was sacked within minutes. Now, Eddie Murphy says the word nigger every third word in his film. Yet this man is putting out a memo saying this word should not be used, it's highly offensive. And he loses his job. And just like the accused in a Moscow show trial in the 1930s, Jonathan Friedland applauded what had happened to him. He said, leaders have to be beyond reproach, and I have let my company down. This is the company I love, where I want everyone to feel included and appreciated. Except himself, that is. And he exited, trailing clouds of disgrace. Google, one of the major corporations in the world that is able to exploit one state and play another state, one state up against another, so that it pays minimum taxation to the states where it operates, asked its engineers why it was there were so few female engineers. And James Damore, 27-year-old, like young Sacco, wrote a memo in answer to this solicitation. He said, maybe women have got different brains. Maybe they don't want to be engineers. Maybe they don't like engineering. Maybe it doesn't suit them. And I'll just make my own observation here. If you go into a newsagent's, there's a big division between the men's thing and the girls' thing. Men's trains, aeroplanes, cars, machines, things that go bang, computers. Girls' thing, magazines, cosmetics, beauty products, etc., etc., etc. We know that women and men read different things. So maybe that's a cultural thing, maybe it's a genetic thing, but he was asked for his opinions. Well, you know what happened to him. And where he was sacked, of course, and he appealed to the American National Labor Relations Board. It ruled that his statements regarding biological differences between the sexes were so harmful, discriminatory, and disruptive as to be unprotected by law. A woman executive of Worcester Polytech, Laurie Leshin, she said, hopefully by exposing the pervasiveness of these demonstrably incorrect opinions, acceleration of change will be possible. So she, of course, welcomed his dismissal for these demonstrably incorrect opinions. Demonstrably incorrect opinions is exactly what the terminology that would have been used by the Moscow show trials in the 1930s. You don't have to demonstrate it. You just use the adverb. It's demonstrably wrong. It's demonstrably heretical. It's demonstrably sinful. It's demonstrably incorrect. And the person thus apostrophized is ruined. And I said earlier on, one of the characteristics about our time is that people don't do what they originally set out to be. Amnesty International, a wonderful organisation, established to defend, liberate, free prisoners of conscience, has mutated into being the very embodiment of political values. So it now supports gay marriage and abortion rights. But what will it do when a woman or a man is prosecuted for campaigning against abortion and gay marriage? That's its original remit is to defend prisoners of conscience. What will it do when the prisoners of conscience are opposed to Amnesty's newly prescribed objectives? One of my favourite examples of how barriers have fallen and that kind of general wishy-washy virtue takes the place of intellectual discipline was the Irish delegation to the climate change conference in 1995. Included 14 members of the Cork Women's Poetry Circle. Now, I'm not sure how meteorologically sound these women are, but their presence wasn't based on their scientific acumen, but on the fact that they were women and they were from Cork and they wrote poetry. The Law Society of Ontario now commits all its members to promote equality, diversity and inclusion. And KPMG Accountants, which is dedicated to minimising the tax bill of major corporations, obliges its staff to promote inclusion, diversity and social equality. So within the regimes in which its companies are operating, it's minimising its obligations to the poorest of those societies. And they call this social inclusion. The largest management consultancy company in the world is Accenture. It has 500,000 employees. And its staff are now being encouraged to wear rainbow ties to illustrate their dedication to inclusion, equality and diversity. And a male heterosexual in Accenture offering an opinion is obliged to begin it by saying, as a straight white man, just to let it be known that he's already putting a discount on the value of what he's saying because he's a straight white man. Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Goldman Sachs, Coca-Cola. These are all companies that are signed on to the new Reich's economic world. These are the most ruthless, single-minded companies in the world. The one thing they do not have in mind is equality. The one thing they do not have in mind is diversity. The one thing they do not have in mind is inclusion. The one thing they do have in mind is commercial success and control, not merely of their workforce, but of their customer base. They want obedience. They want submission. We are creating, from the bottom up, a form of Chinese communism. And we have two systems. We have the Chinese communist system, which is based from the top, draconian, but allows complete free market enterprise without any control to protect workers or the environment. And we have a mirror image now shaping in the Reich that we're shaping or creating in Western Europe and North America and Australia and New Zealand and other outposts of the new regime, where it's driven from the bottom up. Social media has created a mob that will approve of Coca-Cola and Microsoft and Amazon and Goldman Sachs embracing these values that are not values. They don't care for people. But the outcome will be what the intention is, to create a malleable, pliable workforce and a malleable, pliable consumer base that will enrich the very rich. And that's one of the ingredients of the revolution that has been taking place in America, the Trumpian revolution, that the disenfranchised poor, whether they're in the inner city blacks of Baltimore and Detroit, or whether they're Dust Bowl poor of Oklahoma, or in the redundant cities of Ohio and Pennsylvania, the place where there was once industries and there's nothing now. These are the victims of the new corporations that make vast monies, while the poor are left behind without power. It's not yet a Reich in the full sense, but it is shaping in a most sinister direction. And unless we are able to harness the political will to take the risks to end the tentacles which are extending around our throats and our wallets and our willpower, then that Reich will sooner or later triumph. Thank you.